Welcome to this session, which is all about Kerberos. Your first task is to pronounce my surname. Anyone want to have a go? Very good, that's perfect. Well done. No. Hopefully you visited all the sponsors. These are the people that pay for this event, so please go and talk to them, or they make it possible. Even if you may not be interested in any of their products, you never know what you might be interested in 6 months or a year's time, so get some information. Make them feel they made it worth coming, otherwise they might not come next year and we won't have an event, so please go and chat to them. Right, my name is David Postlethwaite. I work for a large financial services organisation in the UK called Liverpool Victoria. I support both Oracle and SQL Server, though I try and steer away from Oracle as much as I can. Fortunately, there are other people who know it a lot better than me. I've been a DBA for 10 years, in the IT industry for too many years. Before I was a DBA, I was a developer. I've done .NET, SQL, Access, Fox Pro, and Oracle. And way back in time, I was a Windows and a NetWare engineer. Anyone remember NetWare? Anyone old enough here? You're showing your age if you can remember NetWare. You were little. So that's a bit about me. Right, Kerberos. I'm assuming you're here because you've all had problems with Kerberos, or all the other talks weren't very interesting. I'm not sure which we're going to go for. You've all had problems with Kerberos? Yes? Or it's just something, okay, interesting. Sorry? You just want to know more. Okay. So if you've had problems with Kerberos, you've almost certainly had this error. That is the error you get, regardless of what your problem is. You have no idea what's gone wrong, and that's all Microsoft give you. But actually configuring Kerberos is really, really easy. And what should be straightforward and simple can lead to all sorts of issues. And with just one error message, which has no meaning whatsoever, trying to resolve things can be very hard. So what we're going to look at today is Kerberos and how it applies to SQL Server and what we need to do to ensure that it works. So what we're going to look at is, what is Kerberos? What is the purpose of it in relation to SQL Server? When do we need it? Do we need to worry about it at all? How do we configure it? What tools do we use to ensure Kerberos is working? Who configures it? Is it your job, the DBA, or is it someone else's job to actually configure it? And why does it cause so many issues? Because on the face of it, setting up Kerberos for SQL Server is really, really easy and straightforward, but it's very easy to get wrong, and when it gets wrong, it's very, very difficult to work out why. And so finally, how do we fix it? When it doesn't work, what can we do to try and get it up and running? So before we look at what Kerberos is, I want to give you a scenario where Kerberos authentication is required for SQL Server. So this is the diagram of the Windows setup that I've got running on my laptop. I've got an active directory domain called CW1. I've got a domain controller, S2, and I've got two SQL servers, S8 and S6. The instances are using a service account of a domain account, which is important in this demo. My little laptop is sitting here, and I'm logged into the domain as an admin just to make life easy, but naturally you wouldn't do that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you what goes wrong. So we're going to flip out of dual screen mode, and we'll see what happens to the monitor, if it can cope. Excellent. Right, this is my laptop. I've got all sorts of things running on here. First of all, I've got some servers running. So this is me logged onto server number 8. Does everyone use Remote Desktop Connection Manager when they're connecting to servers? If you're not, it's a really useful tool because you can build up a big list of all your servers, and it can store the password and login so you don't have to keep on typing it in when you want to RDP. So I've got Management Studio up and running, and it doesn't fit on the screen, so let's see if I can go to... My poor old laptop is really struggling this morning. It keeps hanging because this is rather more than it wants to do. Right, that's better. So we're in Management Studio. I'm connected to Server 8 on this query, and I'm just using AdventureWorks for a bit of fun. Let me just make sure everything's working. Let me just truncate this table. Excellent, so there's no rows in there. So the first thing I'm going to do, there's nothing difficult about any of these SQL queries. We're not going to do anything complicated. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a bulk insert to my table from a file on a different server, in this case on server 6. Yeah? So nothing technical, nothing to catch you out, and that will work and read in the 1,000 rows from that CSV. I'm also going to do a remote collection. So again, I'm just going to do a connection to my other server called S006 and just read some rows from that table. And unsurprisingly, you can do that. You've all done this. You all know how to write remote select statements. Now, I've got a linked server that I've already created here called the name of the server, S006. And the important point of this linked server, if I show you the properties, is under security. I am connecting using my login. Yeah. So I'm logged in. I'm not using a SQL account to connect. I'm using my login to pass through my details to the other server and pull the information back. And again, if I run that, naturally, nothing difficult about any of this. It returns all the rows. And if I want to do a direct query to server 6, then again, you can do something similar to that. And that returns all the databases that are on that server. So there's nothing complicated about this. All right. So let me minimize that and go to Management Studio on my desktop. I've got exactly the same set of queries. So let's just change to AdventureWorks. I'm connected again to my server S8, and I'm going to do that insert from server 6. And when I do that, it fails. It tells me I can't open it, which doesn't make sense, because if I come down here, there is the file, and I can open that in Notepad++. Is that I'm logged in as an admin. It's got domain admin permissions, sysadmin permissions. There's the file. I can open it up, but when I try and open it from within Management Studio, it doesn't work. It tells me access is denied, which doesn't make sense really, does it? Because I've got permissions, so why can't I connect to it? Similarly, if I try and do my remote select again. So again, I'm selecting from AdventureWorks from the server S006, and when I run that, I get an error message, NT Authority Anonymous Login. Well, that doesn't make sense. I'm connected to S006. I can see the table. Why am I getting an error message? And we can carry on and try all of these. The linked server, I will get exactly the same problem. NT Authority Anonymous Login. It doesn't make sense. I have permission. I'm a sysadmin everywhere. Why can't I connect from my laptop via server 8 to server 6? Why is it falling over? And unsurprisingly, this one falls over as well. And this is the problem that you can hit. And this is what common problem that we can have. I am going from my laptop via server 8 to server 6, and it's crashing. Even though I'm a sysadmin in Windows, or a domain admin and a SA on all those SQL servers, it's not allowing me to connect. Why not? That is the big question. So let's go back to PowerPoint and we can explain, if I can see the screen. That's my latest artwork. White cat in a snowstorm. Ah, right. we're back again, jolly good. So this issue that we've hit is known as the double hop problem, which isn't some fancy dance that you may do on May Day. I can connect from server 8 to server 6 directly without any trouble, but I can't connect from my desktop via server 8 to server 6. It falls over. You'll get similar errors if you're using reporting services, where you're going from your web browser via SSRS to a SQL server. If it is trying to pass through your domain name all the way across, you will get similar errors because, again, it is this double hop issue. And the only way to fix this is by using a Kerberos delegation. So why does it fail? Well, we're using NTLM authentication. NTLM was the original authentication that came out with Windows NT. Now, NTLM uses a challenge response protocol to try and authenticate the user. I've cut out a few steps just because it gets complicated if you want it to, but we're going to keep it simple. So we have a user, and he logs in to the client, provides the username and password and the domain. Now the client will compute a cryptographic hash of the password, and then it will throw the password away. So the password is forgotten. And it uses this information to log on to the domain controller. Now the client wants to connect to SQL Server. So it sends the username in plain text to the server. Now the server will generate a 16-byte random number called a challenge, and it sends it back to the client. The client encrypts this challenge with the hash of the user's password and returns it to the server. And this is called the response. Now the server will send the username, the challenge, and the response to the domain controller. And the domain controller will now look up that user in Active Directory and then compute its own version of the response from the password hash it has in Active Directory and the challenge it received from SQL Server. Now the domain controller will compare its own response and the one that it received, and if they are identical, then it tells SQL Server it's okay for connections to take place, assuming you have SQL permissions, and the data will be returned to you. Now what happens when we add a second SQL Server to the mix? As we've just seen, when the client wants to use a resource, it must go through the challenge. So in this scenario, the SQL Server, so we've logged in, the SQL Server will send the username to the second SQL Server. The second SQL Server generates this challenge and sends it back to the first SQL Server. Now the first SQL Server now needs to encrypt that challenge with the hash of the user's password. But it can't, because it doesn't know what that hash is. The hash is only held on that client PC, so it can't pass back the information it needs, and so the connection will fail. And that is why NTLM fails. The server can't authenticate to the next hop without the user's original password, something which it can't get. And as a result, the process can only authenticate to the next step as itself or null and anonymous. And that is why we got that error message. And it's Kerberos and its ability to delegate passwords and pass them through is the solution that we need. Does that make sense? Yeah? Good. So what is Kerberos? Kerberos is a network authentication protocol developed by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the United States back in the 1990s. The name comes from the three-headed dog figure in Greek mythology, known as Kerberos or Cerberus with a C, because there are three parts to the protocol. Or possibly because of Harry Potter. If any of you are Harry Potter fans, if you watched The Philosopher's Stone, Hagrid had a Kerberos called Fluffy, I don't know what the Polish translation for fluffy is, that guarded the philosopher's stone. So if you've watched Harry Potter, are you Harry Potter people in Poland? Or am I? In England it works really well. I just never quite sure what films get around. Then you'll know what a Kerberos is because you'll have seen it. Now, instead of using a challenge each time a client needs to connect to a server, Kerberos uses a concept known as cryptographic tickets. Kerberos is faster and much more secure than NTLM, and with the threat of hacking and data theft, we should be looking at Kerberos for all our SQL servers throughout our whole Windows domain, really. From Windows 2012 R2, it's now actually possible to turn off NTLM altogether and force everything to use Kerberos, and I would expect one day Microsoft will remove NTLM authentication altogether from Windows just because it is not secure enough. One major advantage of Kerberos is you can join to other domains. So if you've got Unix in your company and Windows, they can all share the same login credentials. So you can use your Windows Active Directory login to get onto your Oracle servers, your Linux boxes as well. Interestingly, prior to changes in US law in 2000, Kerberos was actually classed as by the US government as a munition, as a military weapon, so it couldn't be exported. And until the US government changed the law in 2000, it was stuck in the United States. But then they lowered that, and Microsoft put it into Windows 2000, and it's been there ever since. So how does Kerberos work? We've got three components. We have a key distribution center, which has got two parts to it, which is an authentication server and a ticket granting service. And in Windows, this is always going to be the domain controller. We need a client and a server that the client wants to connect to. So we start off. User obviously logs in, enters his login name, password, and domain. The client passes this information to the ticket granting service. No, it passes it to the authentication server for verification. It will then grant a TGT, a ticket granting a ticket. Think of the TGT as a general admission ticket to the domain. It'll let you onto the domain, but isn't necessarily going to let you into any particular service within that domain. Now, when the client wants to connect to the SQL server, the client uses its TGT to request what is called a service ticket. The KDC, the Key Distribution Center, will look up the SQL Server in Active Directory, and if SQL Server is configured for Kerberos authentication, the ticket granting service provides a service ticket to the client. Now think of the service ticket as an admission ticket to a particular object or service within your domain. The client can now offer its TGT and the service ticket to the SQL Server. The SQL Server doesn't have to contact the domain controller for verification. The fact that you have a TGT, which proves you're allowed to be on the network at this time, and a service ticket from the domain controller saying you have permission to try and connect, it doesn't have to bother talking to the domain controller. That's all it needs to know. So it doesn't need to know the user's password. So in SQL Server, you can now return the data to the client, assuming you have SQL Server permissions, obviously. Now, one way to think of the TGT and the ST is to compare it to a theme park. You go to the theme park for the day, you turn up at the pay desk, and you buy a ticket to enter the theme park. That's your TGT. Doesn't necessarily allow you to go on any particular ride, because some of the rides you have to pay extra. So when you want to go on the horrible loop-the-loop that's going to make you sick, you go to the pay desk for that and say, here's my TGT. I've got a ticket to allow me into the park today. Please can I buy a special ticket to go on the loop-the-loop? And they will sell you that, and then you can go to the entrance and go, here's my ticket for today. Here's the proof that I've purchased the ticket for this ride. And then you can get on that ride and be sick, or which usually happens to me on these horrible, on these sort of things. That's the best analogy I can come up with how it works. Now, when the SQL Server sees that you need to connect to our second SQL Server, it can pass our TGT back to the domain controller. It can then request a service ticket for you to connect to the second SQL Server. It will then pass your TGT and that new service ticket to the second SQL Server. Again, the second SQL Server says, I've got all the information I need to prove that you are allowed to do this. It can then pass the data back to the client, assuming that you have SQL permissions. Does that make sense? Go on. Yes. Yes. Kerberos only works if everything is on a domain. It still had to connect to the domain controller. No, it will not have to connect to the domain controller because it has been given. This will have to check that there is a service ticket available for that second SQL Server. Yeah. But the point is, there's no passwords being passed around, so it hasn't got to come back here to find out your password to prove that you are who you say you are. We're using these tickets to prove that you are allowed to be there. So as you can see, Kerberos, as we just said, doesn't depend on the original user and the password for authentication. The only time the original password is used is when the user connects for the first time and authenticates. After that point, authentication to every service is based on having a service ticket for that service. And for the SQL Server to authenticate to the second SQL Server, it just needs to have that TGT to prove that you are allowed on the network at that point. So why doesn't SQL use Kerberos all the time? Well, Kerberos is the default protocol in Active Directory, and on a Windows domain you will have logged into your PC using Kerberos authentication. However, many services and applications don't yet support Kerberos or require extra configuration before you can use it. So every time you log in or try and connect to a SQL Server or any server or Windows Server, whatever it is on your Windows domain, it will always first attempt to try and use Kerberos authentication because you will have logged in. So it will attempt to see if there is a service ticket for that SQL Server or that Windows Server. If it doesn't get the information it wants, then it will revert back to NTLM and allow you to connect. Now, in many cases, SQL Server requires manual configuration to use Kerberos. So in those cases, if it's not been configured, it will automatically revert back to NTLM when you're trying to connect. So how do we configure Kerberos in Windows? As I already mentioned, Kerberos is the default protocol. SQL Server may already be using Kerberos. I've set mine up, so it's not. So we get this error message. But you might not have to do anything. You might find that all your SQL servers are running Kerberos authentication already. If not, we're going to have to do it manually. Now, to configure a service such as SQL Server to use Kerberos, it's going to be done by the domain administrator, or as a minimum, someone who has the right service principal name permission within Active Directory, which almost certainly won't be you. So the good news is Kerberos is not going to be something that you're going to have to do yourself as a DBA. That's going to be the job of the Windows admin or the domain admin. But in my experience, and I have to be careful because I'm being recorded in case some of my friends, colleagues back at work are listening, Windows domain admins don't always know how to configure Kerberos themselves. So it's very useful that you can tell them what to do, and that's nearly always the case in my office. When we're struggling with the Kerberos issue, I'm usually telling my domain admins how to fix it. And they say they watch my YouTube video, which is a recording of this, to remember how to do to Kerberos. So it's worth knowing how to do it so that you can tell the domain admin this is what you need to do. So to enable Kerberos, we need to register something called a service principal name, or SPN, for our SQL Server. Now an SPN is a unique name by which the client can identify your service on a particular host. And all these SPNs are registered in Active Directory. Now, like most things complicated that people struggle to understand, Microsoft has only produced a nice command line utility. There's no GUI for creating SPNs at the moment. And this is called setspn.exe. It'll be installed on all your Windows servers. It probably won't be installed on your desktop. But if you install the remote server administration tools, then you can get this installed on your desktop. But if you log into any of your Windows servers, it'll almost certainly be on there. So to create an SPN, we need 4 things. We need a service class, and in our case for SQL Server it is MS SQL SVC. That can often be the hardest thing you need to find, because you need to go and find it from the documentation as to what your service is. There doesn't seem to be any way of querying an executable to find out what it should be. We need a host name. In my case, I've just got my SQL Server, but you should use the fully qualified domain name for your server, so put the whole string for whatever your server is. We need a port number, so in our case it's going to be 1433, and then we need the account which is actually running the service. So in my case I've been using a domain account to do this, because that's the best way to demonstrate what's going on. If you've got aliases, so if you call your SQL Server by a different name when you connect to it, because you've got a domain alias for it, you must create an SPN for that alias as well as the SQL Server. Restart SQL and everything works. If it was only that easy. That's generally what should happen. Okay, finally, the final bit we need to do is we need to configure delegation. And this is the ability to allow a SQL Server to do the double hop. So Kerberos on its own just gives you improved security. We need to do delegation to allow the double hop. And we can do this via Active Directory users and computers. If you've never heard of Active Directory users and computers, it's one of the most useful things I have. This is where your domain admins create users, create computers, give permissions to groups and the like. When your end user is saying, I can't get onto a SQL Server for whatever reason, Active Directory users computers is really handy to go and see what groups they're in, what permissions they've got, whether their account is locked out. If you haven't got it, it's definitely worth having. I use it as a DBA all the time when I have people telling me they can't get on. I can check they're in the right AD group or not, and then tell them to go and raise the necessary security change to get on there. So for Active Directory, to do the double hop, once the service is running as Kerberos, then we get this extra button called delegation, and then by default it's set to do not trust, so it will not allow the double hop, because you might not want that to be able to connect to another service. Otherwise you can say trust this for delegation to any service, so any connection to anything via server 8 in this case would be allowed. Or if you want to get really clever, then you can limit it to a particular server that it's allowed to hop to. So in this case I'm just saying I can only use Kerberos Authentication to go to, in this case, server 1. And that is what you need to be able to do that double hop. That's the bit that's quite often forgotten. Yep. This is a domain admin. You will not have permission. Yeah, you will not have permission to do this unless you're in a very insecure place. No, it doesn't. So SPN just creates the SPN for the SQL Server in our case, so that it can receive Kerberos connections. The first server is the one that's got to be it has to have permissions to be able to pass your information on. No, as long as the second one is also set up for Kerberos, you'd have to create SPNs on the second one. You don't need to do this on the final hop. No, this is just to allow that hop from one server to the next. If you wanted to go to a third or fourth server, then obviously you would have to give delegation on that as well. We will come to that. We will come to that. Yes, you will be creating, if we go back to this one, so obviously the service account in this case, I've been using a domain account rather than using a local Windows account. But if it was a server, as we will talk about later, then that would be the actual server name rather than the actual... it's the account that runs SQL Server, which is the important bit. Now, where would we be without a DMV to be able to tell whether we're actually using Kerberos Authentication? This query, very useful. It will actually tell you what connections are coming into your SQL Server, whether they're using NTLM, SQL Authentication, or Kerberos Authentication. That is the most useful query of them all. Right, are you ready to see if we can get it to work? We've got half an hour, so we're not doing too badly. This is where I start panicking. So if we come back on to... when we get there, if we can switch back again. Right, I have some batch files already created, so let's create some SPNs. So I'm going to create an SPN, so I've got the line here. So set SPN minus S in this case, followed by MS SQL service. Then I'm connecting to, this is the fully qualified domain name of my server. It's S008 followed by all that. I'm using this domain account in this particular case, and it's now saying registering, and it's registered that for me. Okay, so it's come back and said updated object. Now I'm going to do a second one. You always have to create two, and this time the difference is I've got the port number at the end. So SQL Server connects on port 1433. So again, set SPN minus S for add, which I'll explain in a minute. The fully qualified domain name of the server and the service on port 1433. We've got the service account. Again, it's checking, updated object, and that's done. We'll now just list the SPNs just to make sure that we have what we want, and we've got two SPNs against our service. So MS SQL Server, MS SQL Service, CLW, da-da-da-da-da, on 1433 and one without. It's very important you do one with and one without. I don't understand quite why, but you tend to get errors if you don't do both of them. Now we have to go and have a cup of coffee, come back in about an hour's time and hope that it's all worked. No, it should be a bit quicker. The final bit is I need to restart SQL on here. So let's run this batch file, and if everything is behaving itself, this will stop the service. We'll now just wait a moment. And then we'll restart it again. And that should be it. But I can guarantee that when I've been practicing this and creating this demo, if you ever wanted to learn some good English swear words, you should have been at home when I was writing this a few years ago. So let's come back over here. Let's reconnect to S008. And I did this in SQL Bits a few weeks ago and it worked first time. I did this in Bulgaria last year and it just did not want to work. So let's try our link server and see whether it's worked or not. Hey, we have now done our double hop. It has worked for us. So I'm on S00, I'm on my desktop, connected to S008, and I'm pulling data from S006. Again, if I do my bulk insert now, that will also, if I change to AdventureWorks first, that was probably a bad move, AdventureWorks, that's it. That's now reading the data in. So our problem that we had to start off with has gone away because we are using Kerberos. And if I come down here, Management Studio will behave itself and fill in the rest of the box. Someone has deleted my query. It's not very nice of it, is it? Let's come back over here. No. There we go. So if we run this, hopefully now we should see we have Kerberos connections coming from my PC, which is this one. Oh, that's Kerberos connections, yeah. So we can now see we're using Kerberos, and this one's using NTLM. That's the one that was connecting from the other server. So we're now using Kerberos Authentication, which is what we were after. So it worked. Are you happy? Because which server am I connected to? So I'm connected to server 8. That is coming from... That one's coming from... Well, that's me logged in on my desktop. That is who I'm logged in on my servers. So I assume that connection is probably coming from server 6 back again. Oh, that's IP6 connection. I'm not sure what that one is doing there. I would imagine that that connection is coming from... I don't recognize the IP6 addresses, but I would imagine that's coming from the other server backwards, and it just hasn't updated itself because we haven't rerun that query. So it's still there as an NTLM because we would need to rerun the query. Yes, but I haven't rerun the query from S6 to S8. So when I was setting this up upstairs in the room, I was running queries in all directions just to make sure I had connections. I haven't rerun that query from S6 to therefore pick up. But it would eventually, as you rerun the queries and that server sees that it's now using Kerberos, it would then change to using Kerberos Authentication. But we would need to drop the connection and recreate it. Yeah, reconnect so that it knows it can then get the ticket. Yes. Yeah, if I went back onto my server 6 and reconnected and rerun the query that I used to check that I could see it, then it would go, all right, you're now using Kerberos. It's because that... No, Kerberos is the only thing it will use. Yeah, Kerberos is always the default. It will always try and use that. It'll only revert back to NTLM if Kerberos isn't configured or there's some reason for it not being able to use it. Right. Let's switch back again. Yeah, once Kerberos is running, it's really good. It's just getting it there, and because we've just turned it on, there's probably connections still not seeing that there's been a that it's now configured for Kerberos. It's not seeing the tickets available for whatever reason, and so it just takes time sometimes. As is one of my points, be patient. Sometimes it just takes time before everything settles down again. So why do we get problems? You know, this worked first time, which was quite good. As we've seen, the error message is pretty useless. That's the only error message you get in Kerberos. Now, the most common mistake that used to be with Kerberos was duplicate SPNs. It was very easy to just keep on going, add an SPN. That SPN command that we ran, you used to be able to just run it over and over and over and over again and create lots of SPNs. And then when you try and connect, Active Directory doesn't know which of those SPNs to use, and so it tends to fall over and come up with errors, but not all the time, which is what caused all sorts of issues. Now Microsoft has helped here. Originally we used the -A to add SPNs, and that was where we could keep on adding and adding and adding, and used to end up with all the duplicates. Microsoft then changed it on version which came out with Windows 2012. They created a new option called -S, which is the one that I was using. That will actually check to see if there is already an SPN for that service and tell you, I'm not going to do this, there's already one there. Fortunately, now they've even thought, well, that was a bit of a stupid thing to do, why didn't we actually update the -A? So all the versions now, whether you use -S or -A to add SPNs, will check if there is a duplicate and stop you from creating a duplicate. So the biggest problem, which was duplicate SPNs, is now almost impossible to actually achieve. Always fun, always fun, set SPN -X, just run that on your domain and see how many duplicates you still have, and then go and report that to your domain admins, because that will confuse them, because you'll find there's hundreds of SPNs, because obviously not just SQL that's using it. As you saw in the demo, we can do a set SPN -L, provide the server name or the domain account, and it will actually tell you what SPNs are created for that, which can be really handy. And if you or your domain admin actually needs to delete one, then you can use the -D option. So you can use the L and the X. You probably won't be able to add or delete any, but it's useful to be able to know what to do and what to tell. Some of the more common problems is creating the incorrect SPN. It is very easy to type it in wrong, and Active Directory won't complain if you decide to type it in wrong. Make sure you use the fully qualified domain name of your server when you register it, rather than just the standard short name. Otherwise you're going to get errors. If you're connecting using an alias, again, you need to ensure that you're creating an SPN for that alias as well. SPNs only work for the service account, but it was configurable. I've gone off.
We can hear you, no worries.
Is that the problem? Have I died? The battery's gone flat. There is no green light on my
Okay, so battery.
battery. Oh, I'll keep talking. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so where were we? Make sure your server name's right. Your service account. If you're using a domain account or whatever you're using, and you create that, and then your SPNs are done and it's all working, and you decide to change the service account, you must delete the SPN and recreate it for the new service account. Otherwise, it will fail, which is a common problem we've had where we've been trying to use a more restrictive service account than the one we had, and my DBAs are quite happily changing the service account. Suddenly no one can connect because the SPN is now wrong, so all the connections are failing.
Yeah, but you can actually grant the permission on the domain control to the service account to change the SPN, and when the superstar is
Next slide.
Yeah. Sorry.
So changing the service account. Get the port number right as well. That's really important. Where are we? Yeah, if you're going to use delegation, I was going to say, no end in time yet. Don't forget to enable delegation. That is really important. Thank you. Don't forget to restart SQL Server. If you don't restart, SQL will not see that there is now an SPN for it. Replication is a big issue. If you've got a big domain with lots of domain controllers, you've changed the SPN on one domain controller, you might have to wait 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes for all the other domain controllers to replicate and get that information. So you may have to wait. Stale Kerberos tickets. Now this is an issue I hit at home a few times. even when everything looks correct, the ticket on your PC, that TGT that we have, may not recognise the fact that you've created an SPN. There is a program in the remote tools, service administration tools called KList, which is really, really handy. You can run that and it can show you the tickets that are running, and you can purge your TGT from your PC, your client, and then that will obviously force your client to go and get a new ticket from the domain controller, and then that can sometimes help. We have an option called Sensitive Client. Within Active Directory users' computers, we have something called Account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. If that is ticked, doesn't matter what you do at the delegation level, it will not allow permissions to pass through to the second server. Time synchronization. Make sure all your servers are running within 5 minutes of each other. I had this problem at home because obviously I'm trying to run everything on my laptop, and my laptop had a different time to my domain controller, and everything just went wrong and it just refused to work. And it's not, again, the error message doesn't help because it just says I'm not going to connect. If you're using named instances in SQL Server have a dynamic port. Fix that port, give it a fixed number, because if you stop SQL, it restarts with a different port number, your SPN is instantly invalid because it is based on that port number. So make sure you fix your port number for your named instance. Again, hopefully all your Windows servers are using a fixed IP address and not DHCP, because if the IP address changes, you can get issues as well. Make sure Kerberos is configured on the final server. Obviously I've already done that on my server at the end of the second hop, so we didn't have to go through it. If that isn't configured for Kerberos, you're not going to get the double hop because it's not going to be able to do the second hop because Kerberos isn't enabled further down the line. So make sure everything else is configured. If you use hosts file, another problem I had a hosts file which didn't have the fully qualified domain name, so when it tried to connect, it failed, and that took me ages to sort out. That's when the swear words really got bad at home. So watch out if you have hosts files on your client or anything. Hopefully you're not using hosts files, you're using Active Directory DNS, but it is something to watch out for. It just fails. And finally, sometimes you just need to walk away, come back in an hour's time and see if it's working, because sometimes it just takes a long time for everything to tidy itself up. So just be patient. It's always good for a cup of coffee. Now we get on to the subjects. You may be wondering, as we've already heard, why do we have to go through this pain of creating SPNs manually? Well, the answer is, I can see my notes, why can't SQL Server just automatically do it all for us? SQL Server does try and do it automatically. When you start up, SQL Server will say it's attempting to register an SPN. I'm back on again. Excellent. Thank you very much. And you will see an error message like this in your SQL Server error log. If your server has, or if your account has, permissions to create SPNs, i.e. this right service principal name, then it will automatically create an SPN, and when SQL starts and everything is done for you. But that is unusual for that to happen. And when SQL shuts down, it will delete the SPN for you. But it's unusual for domain admins to allow that to be done, just because it's not particularly secure to allow accounts to have that ability to create accounts. If it doesn't have permissions, then that will fail and you won't get an SPN created. So that's the error message you'll get if it's successful. Or you'll get an error message saying it couldn't create it. And you'll get that error message if you've manually created it, because obviously it couldn't create it because it already exists. So it can be a bit confusing. But if you have permissions, then your service counts permissions and you'll see it creating it. But if you're doing it manually, you'll still see this error message, which isn't particularly useful. It doesn't go, oh, I can see there's an SPN, I'll carry on. It just goes, I couldn't create it. So it's not always that helpful. Now, if you're using SQL Server 2012 and above, then it's quite likely you're going to be using virtual accounts. This one called NT Service MS SQL Server. This is called a local managed account. I guess if you're DBAs, you've probably already seen all that. Because this is a local account managed by the server, it can, because the server has permissions to create SPNs, if you're running with using this, your SQL Server will have created an SPN for you. So if you're using these local managed accounts, then you will have an SPN done for you by the server automatically. You need to be using Windows 2008 and above for this to work, but I would imagine if you're using SQL 2012 and above, you're going to be on a reasonably new server. If you're using the NT service, which is the default if you've ever installed SQL, then it will almost certainly be creating the SPNs for you, and you haven't got to do anything because that is a service account. Though we had a problem on our new domain because someone had turned off some permissions somewhere, which took me nearly a day to solve because the Windows Server team couldn't do it. Moving on from there, an even better choice is something called a group managed service account. This, has anyone heard of group managed service accounts, gMSAs? These are the thing to be using if you are using the right version of SQL and Windows. A group managed service account is a user account and a computer account in one. They're actually held in Active Directory rather than on the local server, and the passwords are generated and maintained by the key distribution server. Group managed service accounts have really complex 240 byte passwords, cryptographically random, changed every few weeks or so you don't know what the password is. They're secure, you cannot log in using them, so no one can use one to try and hack onto the system. They can't be locked out, and this is the way to be going if you have a domain. You need domain functional level 2012 R2 for a group managed service account and SQL 2014 and above. Creating group managed service accounts or setting up your Active Directory domain is not a simple process. There is a good article here written by my friend John Martin on how to do it. To set up your Active Directory, you have to run some PowerShell. It takes 6 or 7 hours to work through and create the necessary bits within Active Directory before you can start creating the group managed service accounts. But it is definitely the way to be going. And again, they have permissions to be able to create your SPNs for you automatically. But I'm not going to go through that because you don't want to sit here for 6 or 7 hours watching PowerShell just rotating. But group managed service account is definitely the way forward. And if you're doing things like always on and clustering where you've got to have the same service account on both sides for the cluster to work, then group managed service accounts is the way to do it. It's definitely what you should be making. Now, you may remember I said that Microsoft only provides you with a nice little command line tool called SPN to help you with your SPNs. Microsoft have produced a program called Kerberos Configuration Manager, which you can download. I would demo it, but one of my servers haven't come up properly, so they're just giving me WMI errors at the moment. If it works really well. Sometimes, thank you, it just falls over. It just will not work. It's very, very flaky. The latest version 4.1 works with SQL 2017. It will create, what is good is you say connect, you connect it to a Windows server, which has got SQL on it. It will go and find all the versions of SQL. It will do it for SQL analysis services and reporting services. It will then tell you whether they're correct, whether they're right, if there's a problem because it's got a dynamic port. And what's even better, it will create a batch file with the SPN command for you, which you can then, if you have permissions, you can run the batch file, or you can send that to your domain admin and say, this is the command you need to run to create your SPNs for you. It is really cool. It is a bit flaky. I haven't seen a version for 2019 yet, SQL 2019 that is. 4.1 is the latest. If you've still got really old servers, 4.1 may not connect correctly with old SQL 2008 servers. If you need version 3 or version 2, I do have them on my cloud somewhere. drop me an email and I can provide you with a link to the older versions if you can't find them. Hopefully there'll be a version for 2019, but this is a really cool tool. I definitely recommend it if you want to, rather than trying to write your own SPNs and get them wrong, this will generate them for you, which makes life a lot easier. So definitely look up Kerberos Configuration Manager. Other tools which are really handy. Have you all heard of DBA tools? The great set of PowerShell tools that come from Rob Sewell and various other people. There is a set of commandlets in there for doing your PowerShell, for doing your SPNs as well. There's ones that will list them, ones that tell you that are missing, and also ones that will create, that do the PowerShell to create them as well for you. So if you're into DBA tools or you prefer PowerShell, have a look at these. Not quite as cool as the GUI, but it does give you all the SPNs that you need, so that's definitely worth looking at. Some of these other tools, probably more useful to your domain admins, but ADC Edit is part of the domain Windows Administration Toolkit, and that's another GUI. A bit like Active Directory user computers, you can really go in and see all the intricacies of your SPN, how it's created, and all the sort of metadata that's behind it, which can sometimes help resolve it, but that's probably a lesson way beyond anything that we can understand. DS ACLs is another tool that allows you to check AD objects again, part of the tool kit, and KList we talk about, which you can use for viewing and purging any tickets which have become stale on your PC, which I have used to fix things. Hopefully you won't have to get into any of them, but they are the tools to be using if you are struggling with issues, or if you're, as I find, if you're helping your domain admin, sometimes it's easier for you to start looking at these rather than waiting for them to do something. That's about it. We're almost out of time. How much have we got left? 5 minutes. Let me just show you a couple of these things. We've got a couple more minutes. Right, I'll just show you any questions. You can read the joke at the end. If you're trying to connect from reporting services, I do have a link which isn't on there, unfortunately. It's a few years old on how to do delegation through reporting services. Yes, because that is doing the first, so there has to be because every step has to be Kerberos, so the reporting server has to be running Kerberos. But again, with the most up-to-date reporting services, it's using a local service account now, NT service / whatever, so it's a local one, so it should be setting up the SPNs. No, you can change the password. It doesn't, the information is just the service, it's not interested in the password at that point. So yeah, the DBA tools, you've got get DBA SPN, test, which will return a list. Oh, you're not seeing anything, are you? So I can see it flashing behind me. So we've got get DBA SPN, which can tell you any SPNs that are created. Test will list the SPNs that you should have, and then you've got set SP DBA, which will allow you to actually set the SPN if you need it, and then delete it if you don't need it. Unfortunately, Kerberos Configuration Manager was not playing ball with me, and it just crashed. It just will not connect at the moment. It's just not in the mood. It relies on WMI to connect, and for some reason, if WMI isn't perfect on your server, then it just doesn't make contact with it, which is really annoying because it should just be looking at the domain controller and then SQL information, and you get errors like this. When it works, it's great. It can just be a bit flaky, but it is definitely worth a tool, definitely worth looking at if you're doing anything with Kerberos, just to check that your SPNs are correct. It's definitely a useful tool. And I don't know whether this will. Are we out of time? Right, we will finish there then. See if it comes back with anything. So thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, we're out of time, come and have a chat. I'm up the front. I believe you can download the PowerPoint or you might be able to download it. Otherwise, contact me if you've got any questions. I can provide you with the T-SQL and the like if you want or any questions. So thank you very much.